Worldwide, faith-based, community-driven streaming media. This is the Voice 17104.com from the Allison Hill District of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now broadcasting community radio from Studio A and community television from Studio B on the Voice 17104.com.
Live from the Voice 17104.com Studio B, it's the Ron Chappell Show featuring news, conversation, and entertainment. Now, here's the host of the show, Mr. Ron Chappell.
Hi, this is Ron, and welcome to my show. And tonight we commemorate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we have a very extraordinary guest host tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's an MLK scholar, and he's the executive director of the Martin Luther King Leadership Development Institute. He's a lecturer, he's a gifted orator, and he's also an author. He's the author of the highly acclaimed book, The 7 Imperatives of Leadership from a Wild Man. He's a recent Platinum Award winner in leadership from Leadership Harrisburg organization. And his lecture, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Man, the Myth, was shown for the 5th consecutive year today on the PCN network. He's been in high demand today. And our humble guest will probably tell you that his greatest degree of notoriety now is being the eldest brother of a podcast host here at The Voice as Minister Kenny Robinson, also known as comedian Kenny Rob of the Kenny's Corner Show. So join me as I welcome my very special guest host tonight, Deacon Joseph Robinson.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Ron, for this unique opportunity to be here tonight to share with your listening audience. This is a very refined audience, and I appreciate that very fact. And so I'm hopeful that tonight I will be able to impart some information about Dr. King that is commensurate with what your audience has come to expect from this broadcast. I want to speak tonight from a subject that I like to speak from when I talk about Dr. King. And so I'm going to take about 30 minutes or so and just go through a speech that I'd like to share with you to have us think about Dr. King. And then following that, we'll have some an opportunity for Q&A, for comments, for you to call in to the number, which if you want to write it down now, it's 717-889-7181. 889-7181. And later on, I'm going to be joined by that younger brother of mine that Ron made mention of, Kenny Robb, Minister J. Kenneth Robinson, will join me to participate in the conversation and dialogue to follow. So sit back and put on your listening ears as we ponder the question, why bother? Why bother? In 1929, down in Atlanta, Georgia, a son was born to Reverend Michael King Sr., pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. After taking a trip to Germany and having become inspired by the German theologian Martin Luther, he changed his name and that of his 5-year-old son, Michael Jr., to Martin Luther King. Dr. MLK King Jr., of course, grew to become the moral conscience of America in his day. Despite a wisdom and focus that belied his young age, Dr. King courageously defended the rights of all people and challenged the prevailing powers to see the U.S. Constitution in its brightest light and vigorously defend its universality. Today, all of America took time to remember and reflect on the life and legacy of this great patriot and citizen of the world. Of all the federal holidays, this holiday is the only one that requires us to do something for others. It is a day on, not a day off, a day of service, not sleeping. Yet, as we pause all over America to honor the memory of Dr. King, I am compelled to ask the question, why bother? Despite Dr. King's undeniable alliance with organized labor and recognition of the role it played in creating a middle class, there is a large and growing segment of the population who, rather than reform unions that very well may have overreached in some instances, they seek to eradicate them entirely. And so for those who have a vitriolic disdain for organized labor, I ask, why bother to celebrate the life of Dr. King? Despite this Baptist preacher's unflinching belief in the agape love exhibited by Jesus Christ, there are those who renounce the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and live instead by the mantra, every man and woman for him or herself. For those who view the notion of brotherly love as irrational, yet you pause to observe the life and legacy of Dr. King, I ask, why do you bother? Despite Dr. King's willingness to withstand even his inner circle, who urged him to distance himself from Bayard Rustin, an openly gay Black man who served as chief strategist and organizer for the 1963 March on Washington, there are those whose ideological beliefs trump their ability to see the inherent value of all human beings. Standing with heels dug in deeply, they pause to honor the legacy of Dr. King while denying others their unalienable rights as tax-paying American citizens. And to them, I ask, why do you bother? Despite Dr. King's courageous and unpopular criticism of the war machine that diverted much needed funds from poverty programs, there are those whose actions today suggest America's interests abroad supersede her interests at home. While heaping platitudes of praise upon the memory of Dr. King, they simultaneously rail against an increase to the minimum wage or affordable health care. The question begs to be asked, why do you bother? Dr. King insightfully declared that the struggle of the Negro was no different than the struggle for freedom and self-respect underway in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and even poor whites in America. In his I Have a Dream speech, he stated that many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. Despite his bedrock belief in an idyllic, beloved community, there are those who will dutifully observe the holiday while maintaining an inexplicable sense of superiority and privilege. And to them, we must ask, why bother? Well, I would like to suggest here tonight 3 reasons that people of goodwill should bother to remember the life and legacy of Dr. King, and then we'll take questions and have commentary. First of all, we bother because Dr. King bothered. Here was a man who graduated high school at 15, earned a bachelor in sociology at 19, a bachelor of divinity at 22, and a PhD at 26. Makes you feel like an underachiever, doesn't it? His father was pastor of a prominent church in Atlanta, and he could have pursued any profession of his choosing. And yet, when pressed into service, he responded to the call, reluctantly at first, but ultimately with his total being. And I'll say more about this momentarily. Most of this is common knowledge and often repeated, lifting Dr. King to a mythical status, just that many believe it is not within themselves to emulate. But let's pause a moment and look at Dr. King, the man. Having just recited his academic credentials, we know he was a bright young man, well advanced beyond his years. But aside from being bright, he was not unlike most young men, and I dare say women, attending college away from home for the first time. It was at the former Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, that he became particularly fond of smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and shooting pool. It's reported he became a bit of a pool shark, attributable to many sessions that lasted until 3 a.m. Always possessed with a keen eye for the opposite sex, he even experienced his first interracial romance at Crozier. In 1950, this would likely never have happened in his home state of Georgia, at least not openly. But as we used to say, you've got a friend in Pennsylvania. This romance was born out of an unusual love triangle involving himself, a professor with whom he played pool, and Betty, the daughter of a German immigrant cook at the school cafeteria. Although Betty was originally Professor Smith's girlfriend, King eventually wooed her away from his pool buddy, causing an irreparable rift in their friendship. I might add that King's interest in Betty was no passing fancy. King actually fell in love with Betty and desired to marry her. After many consultations with friends and thinking of his future as a Black Baptist pastor in the South, he concluded that the pain this would cause his mother was more than he could bear. And so, while emotionally conflicted and irritated with the limits society had placed upon them, he made the pragmatic decision to end the relationship. After graduating from Crozier, he enrolled at Boston University, where he earned his PhD. In that environment, befitting an intellectual, he developed the habit of smoking and fiddling with a pipe. While attending Boston University, he sought to win the favor of a beautiful young student at the New England Conservatory of Music by the name of Coretta Scott. Gifted with a smooth tongue, he loved wooing the ladies with his lines. When he contacted Coretta, he began with, you know, every Napoleon has his Waterloo, and I am like Napoleon. I'm at Waterloo and I'm on my knees. And to that, Coretta replied, "That's absurd. You don't even know me." She admitted that she was not initially impressed with his 5'7" stature. But over time, the more he so eloquently spoke of his dreams and aspirations, the more he mesmerized her with what she called his intellectual jive, the taller he grew in her eyes. He wore tailored suits and drove a brand new Chevy, gifted to him by his father, Reverend King Sr., for graduating at the top of his class at Crozier. I might point out that Daddy King, as he was called, paid all his son's expenses while at Boston University. Interestingly, although King was raised in an Atlanta upper middle class family, he personally rebelled against the notion of acquiring personal wealth. Case in point, in 1964, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which consisted of a $54,000 cash award, Dr. King insisted the award was validation of the movement and not him alone. And so he divided the money equally among 6 organizations: the SCLC, the NAACP, the Congress on Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, the National Council of Negro Women, and the American Foundation on Nonviolence. MLK III once said on one of his visits to Harrisburg, in fact, he came to Harrisburg and spoke down at Strawberry Square, MLK III, and I was there among the audience, and he once said that Reverend Hosea Williams, who was one of Dr. King's lieutenants, had said to him, "Martin, the reason I was able to follow your father is because of 2 things. He overcame the love of money and the fear of dying." Dr. King was beaten, arrested, stabbed, run out of town, endured innumerable death threats and was ultimately assassinated. But I hope you recall, as I do, his stirring and triumphant declaration that night before he was assassinated, when he said, "I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man, for mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And so we bother to remember the man because he bothered to put it all on the line to challenge our country to breathe life into the declaration that all men are created equal. But as I alluded to earlier, he was initially reluctant at assuming the mantle being thrust upon him. It's often stated that leaders are not made, are not born. Leaders are made, not born. And I agree. I also contend that leaders do not always leap forward. Often they are pushed. Reverend Andrew Young, the former U.S. ambassador and mayor of Atlanta, was a loyal King disciple. But he disclosed, he said, "I'm convinced that King never wanted to be a leader. I mean, everything he did, he was pushed into it." He further insisted that King got trapped into the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that coordinated the 381-day bus boycott. You see, Dr. King pursued his PhD because of his aspirations to teach religion and philosophy at the college level. He envisioned himself pastoring a progressive church while engaging and challenging the thinking of aspiring leaders. But as John Lennon so insightfully stated, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. Often criticized for his insistence on justice and equality, the last year of his life, he was embattled and attacked by friends and foes alike. And I say that whenever you take an uncompromising stand against injustice in all its various forms, when you place principles over personal peril, you will be shunned, isolated, criticized, harassed, and threatened. He gave over 2,500 speeches in his lifetime, as many as 450 per year for several years. That's more than one speech per day. Imagine the toll such a schedule had on his wife and their 4 young children. After being repudiated by others for denouncing the Vietnam War in 1967 and attempting to link the peace movement with the civil rights movement, he pivoted and tried to generate interest in a poor people's campaign. He met with 53 non-Negro minority group organizations to build a broader coalition. Unfortunately, due to a date with Destiny in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of striking sanitation workers, the campaign never materialized. The rest we know is history. And so, number one, we bother, my friends, because Dr. King bothered. Secondly, I contend that we bother so that we never forget. For many, the civil rights movement is regarded as ancient history. But the reality is, I was 8 years old when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. When the University of Virginia opened its doors in 1970 to women seeking an undergraduate degree, I was 13 years old. When February became National Black History Month in 1976, I was 18 years old and graduating from Harrisburg High School. Go Cougars. If it happened during my lifetime and many of yours, then it can't be ancient history. I still remember watching with pride Johnny Carson with his special guest, the late General Daniel Chappie James Jr., the first Black 4-star general in American military history, who was named commander of NORAD. General James said at that time that he was looking forward to the day that achievements such as his would be noteworthy and not newsworthy. In 2016, Emmanuel J. Coleman III, a young Black cadet, became West Point's first captain and class president, placing him among the ranks of only 7 other cadets in Academy history to hold both of these titles. including General John J. Pershing, no less. In 2017, Simone Askew became the first Black woman to hold the position of first captain and leader of the West Point Academy Corps of Cadets. In 2018, Lieutenant General Darrell A. Williams, a 1983 West Point graduate, returned 35 years later to become the first Black superintendent of the West Point Academy in its 222-year history. But these gains and countless others did not come without great sacrifice of life. They too are not ancient history. When three young men, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were killed in 1964 in Mississippi trying to register Blacks to vote, I was 7 years old. And when Dr. King was killed in 1968, I was 11 years old. We bother to honor the legacy of Dr. King so that amidst all the electronic and social media distractions of our day, we never forget the sacrifices that were made by so many on our behalf. We must not forget the message of Dr. King. It was more than a dream that his children would one day be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Rather, he spoke of peace and justice and love. He said, "We have never had peace in the South, I dare say America. We have had a negative peace, which is merely the absence of tension. We've had a negative peace in which the Negro patiently accepted his situation and his plight. True peace is not merely the absence of some negative force of tension. It is the presence of a positive force, of the presence of justice and brotherhood. To those who question his use of nonviolent protests to defy the law with peaceful marches and demonstrations, he declared, there are just laws and there are unjust laws. A just law squares with a moral law, with what is right. So any law that uplifts human personality is a just law. And conversely, any law that does not square with the moral law of the universe, with the law of God, is an unjust law. So any law that degrades the human personality is an unjust law. And therefore he believed that any individual who disobeys a law whose conscience tells him it is an unjust law, and he is willing to accept the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that man is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law. Incidentally, these were the words written to his clergyman detractors in his letter from Birmingham jail, outlining his philosophy and his 4 basic steps for successful nonviolent direct action. What are those 4 steps? Number 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. Number 2, negotiation. Number 3, self-purification. And number 4, direct action. He explained that the 4th step, that is, marches, demonstrations, etc., seek to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. In today's divisive climate, with an ever-increasing resurgence of hate groups, it is easy to understand why today's young activists take to the street to march and protest about a variety of systemic inequities. I am elated to see the young men and women full of vim and vitality, passion and persistence rise up and make their voices heard. It has always been the young generation who push the envelope to bring about change, and so we celebrate them. However, we who are either students of history or have lived through history must redirect our young people and acquaint them with Dr. King's 4 steps. For a protest to be impactful, there must be an identified antagonist. and articulated demands put to the antagonist for adoption. We can't become enamored by the ability to draw a crowd and talk loud. For Dr. King, direct action protest was the last resort when all attempts at negotiation had failed. The direct action was taken for the sole purpose of driving the antagonist back to the negotiation table. But what is also overlooked among our current protests is step 3, self-purification. This is a step whereby the marchers were trained in the precepts of nonviolence. There they asked themselves, can I withstand an unprovoked blow or insult without retaliation? Am I prepared to go to jail if necessary for this cause? These steps are not applicable only to those fighting injustice. Those steps would have served those well who besieged the Capitol on January the 6th. One of them, Mrs. Virginia Spence, recklessly and without forethought forced her way into the Capitol. Her attorney weakly argued that she had eaten up media coverage of protests that erupted across the country in the summer of 2020 after Officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd in Minneapolis. This is what he said. After months of watching our major cities burn, many people became convinced that vocal displays of outrage in the form of protesting was the only way to make their voices heard. I submit that had they observed Dr. King's 4 steps, their actions would have been as peaceful as the revisionists have attempted to portray them. During the final year of his life, Dr. King issued prophetic words of warning to a country he loved dearly. He said, America, I don't plan to let you rest until the day comes when all God's children are respected and every man will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. America, I don't plan to let you rest until seats from every state house are occupied by men who will do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before their God. America, I don't plan to let you rest until you believe what you have read in the Bible, that out of one blood, God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. So not only do we bother because Dr. King bothered, and not only so that we never forget, but finally we bother because history repeats itself. President Harry Truman said the only thing new in this world is the history you don't know. We only need look back at recent elections to recall the legislative tinkering that has been done by many state legislatures to require voters to secure a new government-mandated form of photo identification in order to exercise a right they had enjoyed for years. To those old enough to remember, this unfunded requirement is akin to the long outlawed poll tax. The fact that elementary school performance is used as a forecaster of the prison growth rate, that young Black men are more likely to be stopped and frisked than whites, Latinos, or Asians, 5 times more likely to be killed. We call Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Dante Wright, and Ahmaud Arbery. They're 21st century examples. That Blacks who are 13% of the US population, but 38% of the prison population, largely due to nonviolent drug-related offenses, are all reasons that we must bother to remember Dr. King and the cyclical nature of history. Frederick Douglass observed that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you've found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or both. And so as I close, I say unto you that we must bother. When our time here is ended, we all want to go to our Maker with a clear conscience. In the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson, played by the late Chadwick Boseman, Branch Rickey, played by Harrison Ford, he said to the Phillies general manager, Herb Pinnock, who threatened to boycott the game if the Dodgers insisted on Robinson Plain. And in that gravelly voice, Harrison Ford mimicking Branch Rickey said, "Herb, someday you're gonna meet God." And when he inquires as to why you didn't take the field against Robinson in Philadelphia, and you answer because he was a Negro, it may not be a sufficient reply. None of us will live forever, and how you live your life makes all the difference in the kind of world you will leave behind. How sad it would be to live your life and no one take note of your existence or your expiration. As already demonstrated, Dr. King was no different than you or I. He had the same insecurities, the same shortcomings, the same aspirations. He did no more than any of us can do if we are willing to pay the price. Sirius XM radio talk show host Joe Madison, aka the Black Eagle, says, he says that the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And my friends, if we are going to change the divisive rhetoric and discourse populating our conference rooms and our kitchen tables, if we are ever going to bring to fruition that beloved community that Dr. King envisioned, then we must take a stand against injustice and racism, one conversation, one interaction, one relationship at a time. Whether it's the coal miner, the school teacher, the factory worker, the displaced white-collar manager, the Me Too movement, or Black or Blue Lives Matter, we must learn from the example Dr. King provided in 13 tumultuous years of a very short 39 years of living. Dr. King's life was embodied by the song recorded by the late, great Mahalia Jackson, which said, "If I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain." The day after Christmas, a couple years ago, we lost Bishop Desmond Tutu, who said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Finally, Dr. King said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And this is why we must bother." Thank you so much for indulging me and listening. And now this is your opportunity to certainly call in 717-889-7181. And I'd like to bring to the studio now my younger brother, Minister J. Kenneth Robinson. Kenny, good to see you tonight, sir.
How you doing there, big brother? How you doing?
Thank you for joining tonight. We asked the question, why bother? Why bother? Why bother? Why don't you answer that question from your perspective, sir? Why do we bother? And again, I remind you, feel free to call in. We want to hear from you. Got 717-889.
Caller, you're on the air live. Go ahead with your comment or question, please. Hello? Go ahead, caller, with your comment or question, please. You're on the air live.
Well, I don't have a question. I just have a few comments to my good brother Joseph Robinson.
Good Carl.
And brother Kenny Robb, I just want to say well said, and I appreciate you sharing the light on Dr. King's personal life.
Yes.
Brother Joe, I also want to comment on the transition from Dr. King moving from equality in integrated areas, segregated areas in the South and in the North, and how he went to the Poor People's Campaign. He realized that in order to have true equality, you need to have economic equality.
Come on now.
Hence, you had the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which opened some doors for equality in housing, because Dr. King realized what good is being able for Blacks to go into the downtown department stores if Blacks couldn't afford to shop there in the first place.
That's right.
So that's why he really generated that move toward the voting rights and integration to Poor People's Campaign, to make sure that people had decent living wage. And when he did that, as Joe mentioned earlier, some of his supporters distanced themselves.
That's right.
You know, they said, why bother? If they're gonna be equal with us, and we have to give up some of our jobs potentially to these Negroes, as we were called back then, why bother? They were saying, I'm not sure I want to give up some skin and put that in the game. That's my comment. I appreciate you, brother. You're just as astute as you were when you were in high school. Continue to do good work, brother.
Thank you so much. That's because I was following your lead. Kyle Brown's one of the smartest men I know at Harrisburg High School, Kyle Russell Brown. Thank you, brother, for calling in. Vernon Jordan said something. Oh, I'm sorry. Vernon Jordan said something similar to what Kyle Brown said. Vernon Jordan said, he said, what good is it to be able to check into a hotel if you don't have the means to check out?
My mind.
All right. The lines are open, 717-889-7181. So Kenny Rob, why do you bother? Why should we bother?
Well, just like Dr. King was, you know, he stood on the shoulders of so many people, and we stand on the shoulders of Dr. Martin Luther King. But I take it a little personal. Why bother? That's like being a father. Like why bother being a father?
Mm-hmm.
You know, my daughter Heather was afforded a lot of opportunities. You know, because I did bother.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things she told me one day, I said, "Why are you working 2 jobs?" She said, "Because I saw you working 2 jobs."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so why bother? I bother because I'm trying to leave a legacy. Why bother? Because I'm trying to make a mark somewhere. Why do I counsel? Why do I preach? Why do I mentor? You know, why bother? It doesn't seem like to help nobody. But yeah, like it's like the songwriter said, if I can help somebody,
That's right.
then my living will not be in vain. So
That's right.
why bother? That's why I bother.
It'd be, as I said, it'd be a sad thing to leave this world and no one take note of your existence or your aspirations. Lord have mercy. And I say also, you know, our children, you know, we've got to get back to enforcing these values in our kids. You know, there was a time you didn't talk back to your kids, but now these kids are almost, you know, run you out your own house. And we've got to arrest that. That's a internal problem we've got to fix. We've got to get back to where we help our kids understand that education is critical, education is important, and education is non-negotiable. You ain't dropping out of school if you living in my house. You're gonna finish school, and you're gonna go to school, and you're gonna go there to learn, because I know the value of that education. We have got to reclaim those sense of family values, and if we don't, then I would say to us, why do we bother to celebrate Dr. King if we're not going to do the fundamental things of reinstituting and establishing those core values in our homes? Again, the line is open, 717-889-7181.
Well, I know why we didn't drop out.
Well, why didn't we drop out? Go ahead, tell why did we drop out, get it out? Well, because I know who you're going to talk about. Go ahead.
Well, you know, there was a picture of a baby lion, and the lion was always, you know, and he was wondering why the hyenas got afraid of the little lion, because behind the baby lion was the big lion. It was the big lion, and so Mom always said, "Go to school, get up, do this, do that, do this," and then we get, Mom, I don't feel like it, and all of a sudden you look up, and we saw Joe Robinson Sr.
Yeah,
and then it was like, well, you know what, Mama? School ain't so bad.
I used to say to people, yeah, and I borrowed this line from a comedian, not my brother, but another comedian, who said that the teacher sent a note home from school one day and said, Mr. Robinson, we believe Joey has ADD. And my dad would write back his own note. Well, he won't have it tomorrow. So that's how Kid and I were raised.
That's how we were
raised. Barbara, that's how we were raised.
And I got a report card that said Kenny talks entirely too much. But Dad said, let that be on the next report card. the next report card that came out, it said, Kenny does not participate in class question and answer. And when my dad asked me, well, why don't you participate? I said, because I don't want her to mistaken me answering questions and talking in class.
The lines are open 717-889-7181. Why do we bother to celebrate Dr. King? Why do we bother?
So let me ask you this question.
Yes, sir.
He was such a great believer in nonviolence.
Correct.
What do you think the feeling was to the white oppressors who wanted to paint us as violent people, and then we never got violent? That must have frustrated them to no end, to say these are violent, these are ignorant, barbaric people, yet we singing gospel songs and marching in peace.
Mhm.
You know, that had to frustrate somebody.
Well, you have to understand, first of all, I believe King's fundamental belief in the power of love, first and foremost. We have to always remember that Dr. King was a Baptist preacher, a Baptist preacher. It was said that he's been to school, we know that, and he read so many books, so many authors he'd read, studied. And one day, Wyatt T. Walker was asked, of all the authors that Dr. King has read, which authors have influenced him the most? And Wyatt T. Walker, one of his lieutenants, said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the influence of Dr. King. He was first and foremost a gospel preacher who believed in the ethos of love. And so therefore, it was not just some mere tactic to say we're going to be nonviolent. He believed that fundamentally to his core. And so he also believed, as he said, unearned suffering is redemptive. And what does that mean? It says when you are willing to suffer blows or slights or etc., it has a psychological impact on your oppressor. And they, to the point where they began to almost be ashamed of the way they're treating you, to the point that now they alter their behavior and you reconcile. And that's his ultimate goal. His entire notion of beloved community was about reconciliation, bring people together. That's what he wanted to do. So for him, they weren't frustrated that people would still inflict violence on them, because he believed that would ultimately have some redemptive value. Now that didn't work when he got out to Chicago now, but it did work on the folk down in the southern states. And so he believed that philosophically and fundamentally, that was the way to bring about change. And so you do it through a nonviolent approach. And so he never would have walked away from that. People ask today, would he still contend that today? Yes, he would still contend that today. He may not have felt that everybody is salvageable, but that they would eventually come around. There are some people he would probably have written off as a lost cause, but philosophically, he would never have abandoned the notion of nonviolence, because it was the epitome of who he was and what he represented. The lines are open, 717-889-7181. You have something else there, Mr. Robinson?
So as a deacon and preacher, we heard it in the Bible a bunch of times about, when people are mean to us, or we're supposed to be kind to them. The Bible says it's like pouring hot coals.
Yeah, you heap hot
coals
on the head. That's a heat coals on the head. That's right.
So he really believed that and lived by it.
And lived by it. That's right.
I mean, that was just the amazing thing.
That's right. That's right. I participated today. Super reader Floyd Stokes in the American Literacy Corporation had book readings, and all of the not all, but several of the many, well over a dozen, maybe 20 coffee shops all over this area, East and West Shore. And I was one of the guest readers. And at my location, it was Rabbi Miroff and Una Martone. And we were reading to some kids there. But one of the young men asked us a interesting question. He said, what do you all think would have been Dr. King's superpower? What was Dr. King's superpower? You know, we think of our heroes, whether they went faster than a speeding bullet or whatever. You know, what was Dr. King's superpower? So Kenny, what do you think was Dr. King's superpower? And anyone else, feel free to call in 717-889-7181. Dr. King superpower.
His temperament.
His temperament.
His temperament. My goodness, he couldn't be shook. You know, Joe, you remind me a lot of Dr. Martin Luther King. I mean, first of all, he went to Morehouse, prestigious.
Yep.
You went to University of Virginia.
Yeah.
You know, go Who's. Prestigious. He was an alpha man.
Hey, I'm repping the colors tonight.
Okay. You was an alpha man.
That's right.
And he didn't believe in violence. And for the most part, you don't believe
That's right.
in violence.
I left that to you. That's right.
Even Jesus had Peter.
Let me say one other thing. I was going to, before we run out of time, I did want to talk about Malcolm versus Martin. That's always an interesting conversation. Malcolm versus Martin. And I do want to hear from the callers, 717-889-7181, as we pivot momentarily to talk about Malcolm and Martin. Now, there are those who, you know, you talked about those two positions, Malcolm versus Martin. Malcolm, we always heard about any means necessary, and Dr. King's talking about love. And so you tried to reconcile those two approaches. But we had to first get an appreciation. Just as we talked about Dr. King, the man, we need to have an appreciation for the man, Malcolm, and contrast those two. Because Dr. King, as I said, was raised in a middle to upper middle class home. I believe someone's calling in.
Sure. Good evening, caller. You're on the air live. Go ahead with your question or comment, please.
Yes, this is Mr. Jerry Porter.
Hello, Mr. Porter, the Honorable.
What's up, man?
How you doing, brother?
You touched on my subject, Malcolm versus Martin.
Yes, sir.
And I even though it's his day, I'm a Malcolm.
You're Malcolm. All right.
I thank God that I think that Martin Luther King was right about it, what he was trying to do and how he was trying to go about it. But because of Malcolm, they pushed his agenda a little further.
That's true. That's true.
And so I hold Dr. Martin Luther King in high regard.
All right.
But I thank God for Malcolm.
Well, they were definitely complimentary. Now you have to understand, and thank you for calling, Mr. Porter. They were complimentary now because they had different backgrounds. Remember, King grew up middle class, highly educated, etc. Malcolm grew up, watched his father get killed by some white racists as a young man. You know, beg pardon?
Well, that's the argument that says your environment does have your environment does cause
correct
you to move in certain directions.
That's right, and that's the point we're trying to make, Mr. Porter. You're right, because a lot of times we have to understand and appreciate that their lives were both informed and shaped by different circumstances. King, studied at the highest institution of learning. Malcolm got his education while imprisoned, and studying with the Nation of Islam, and came out and went through the hard knocks of life, and having had that tragedy of seeing his father killed. So that informed his life. And so when he grows up, and the fact that his ministry is taking place in the inner city, full of slums, rat-infested buildings, low-paying jobs, looking at people in Harlem struggling, that was what he looked at every day. Dr. King and those in the South, yes, they were poor, rural Southerners, were discriminated against and with segregation, but and that was horrible. And it had segregation in the North too. But just look, but even if you had a little bit of a farmland in the South, you could kind of grow some crops and make it. But it's hard to make it in the inner city, living in a high-rise tenement, with poor heating and everything else that goes on. So they had two different battlefields, if you will. And so that's one reason why their messages were different, because they were looking at the same issue about racial equality and Black folks getting what they deserved, but they were also coming at it from different perspectives because they were fighting similar yet different battlefields, if that makes any sense.
No, that is quite true, but at the same time, even though I say I hold Dr. King in high regard.
That's right.
If we look at the history, the oppressed people, it's never given up willingly.
Oh no question.
They don't give it up.
Power concedes.
Never been given.
Power concedes nothing without a struggle.
Yes, power doesn't relinquish itself.
No,
they had
sir.
to stand up and take a point, got to get to the point where they were like, enough's enough.
That's right. That's
like,
right.
Like I said, if you look at the history of the world, they never give the oppressed people.
That's right.
Their freedom.
Well, let me say something else.
Actually, had to come and say, let them go.
Right. Well, let me say something else you said that was very insightful, and that is the fact that Malcolm's approach forced those who would oppose Dr. King, and forced them to pay attention to what Dr. King had to say, because it would come down to, you either listen to me and my approach, where I'm talking about let's go, go at everybody, or you listen to Dr. King and his love message. And so some people who, it caused some people then to say, maybe we better listen to this King guy, because this Malcolm guy, we can't work with him. So they contended. And also you need to also understand, both of these gentlemen evolved. They both started at polar opposites. King believed that everybody was redeemable. Malcolm initially started out believing that white folks could not be trusted. They were devils, evil, don't want nothing to do with them. Then King, having had some experiences in Chicago and finding out that there are some white people who are never going to come around and get beyond their hatred. And then Malcolm, he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca and saw Muslims of every stripe, color, and nationality. And he said, whoa, this Islam is bigger than race. And he then began to move more to the center and began to recognize that there's some power in coalition. So he also was getting away from his super militant approach, and King was getting away from his completely confidence in mankind and their ability to come around. So they both were moving towards each other from their polar opposites, moving closer to the center. That's something that is often overlooked as well.
This is true. This is true because, like you said, there was a time when Malcolm hurt everybody. And then as he found out, but that just comes along with maturity, period. There's a statistic that says the most pregnant people in the world are old Black men.
Old Black men. Not old white men, just old Black men.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Just old Black men only, not old white men and all other kind of men?
No, one of the most pregnant people in the world are old Black men, because they've lived through it. So, like when you mature and you go through it, but it does have a reckoning with you. It does. It takes you from where you used to be, and it, like you just said about Dr. King and about Malcolm, their maturity, their view on the subject changed.
And you're right. And it's a function of not only maturity, but it's also a function of your experiences. And keep in mind, both of these men were killed at age 39. Neither one, these weren't old guys. So they were still evolving in their development, even as people, as men, because these were young men who got killed. So they were some tremendous leaders, but we still have to remember that these were young men. And so you're right, James, with over time, as they matured, as their experiences, as they had different experiences, they began to evolve. And that's what happens to all of us if we expose ourselves to different situations and different opportunities, different experiences. There's a guy who's dead and gone, Charlie Tremendous Jones. He used to say, you will be the same person you are today 5 years from now, except for two things: the people you meet and the books you read. So it's our experiences that cause us to hone and shape and reshape and rethink our various positions. The number is 717-889-7181. I know the hour is drawing to a close, but we need you to call in if you've got something else to share. We want to hear from you. You said, what you say his superpower was, Kenny? His what? Dr. King, I asked you, what was his superpower?
His superpower was his it was on the lines of his patience.
His patience.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought his superpower, what I said to the young man today, I said his superpower was believe it or not, was his voice, from the standpoint that he was able to move people to action. That was his superpower. He was able to move people to action. And so he was able to take people, he was able to help people to understand and appreciate the value in going to jail in droves, to illustrate your point, to take a stand. He said in that last speech before he was assassinated, we all know about the soaring rhetoric at the end where he says, but I'm not worried about that right now. I've been to the mountaintop. Everyone's heard that. But in that same sermon, he talked about how as he looked back on his life and reflected on all the eras that he could have lived in, all the places in time he could have lived. He said, I could have lived in the days of the Greek Parthenon. I could have lived in the days, of when of the Civil War, whatever. But he brought his stuff up. He said, but here I am today, at a time where I was able to live and see people in Albany, Georgia, men and women in Albany, Georgia, straighten up their backs. He said that's the time I'm so glad I lived to see. He said, because when your back is straight, when you're standing up straight, nobody can ride your back. And that's what he was so happy that he was able to see. And so that's what what we want to take from this man in terms of his ability to, in my estimation, in terms of his superpower, his ability to mobilize people, to encourage them, to make them believe that their cause was just, that God was on their side, that as I said, that the mark, what's it, the moral arc is long, but it bends towards justice. That's what he was able to help people to see. These were revolutionary concepts for a mass of people to embrace and believe. And so that was in my estimation, his superpower was the ability to mobilize through his voice and his rhetoric and his language and his visualization. As we say in the church, he could paint a picture and help people see what he was trying to achieve. And so that, to me, was his superpower.
Are you saying his superpower, he's a motivator man?
A motivator man?
Motivator man.
But he definitely was a motivator man, but motivator man with a lot of substance, He didn't just talk to get people saying, yeah. He caused people to take action. 300, and it wasn't just him. There's a whole lot of people behind that bus boycott in Montgomery. In fact, a lot of women were behind that bus boycott. The Women's Political Committee, Joanne Robinson, a professor at Alabama State in particular. But he was able to help people, motivate people to keep walking for 381 days to stay off the buses. So yes, he was a motivator, but with substance, to help people, because they could see the end result. They could see why this was crucial and critical. Because anybody can, as Joe Madison said, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. Anybody can move me today when I go hear a speech, but now how much sacrifice am I willing to invest? And that's what King was able to do, was move people to make the sacrifice. 717-889-7181. We're almost out of time.
You know, Joe, when you talk about Malcolm and Martin, you know, and how Martin grew up and how Malcolm grew up,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I just think it's kind of funny because we grew up in the same house.
You and me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know. I don't think I would have been Muslim.
You would have.
But I'll throw a rock.
Yeah, I know that's right. That's right.
In the crowd.
That's right. That's right. Well, is there any other 717-889-7181? Oh my goodness, I see my brother Gibson is on the line. William Gibson out of Philadelphia, an Alpha brother, one of the illustrious professors at the University of Pennsylvania, an outstanding preacher, orator, Alpha man. I don't know if he has time to call in, but 717-889-7181. Boy, I'd love to hear your voice tonight. I believe the people would benefit from hearing your voice before we go off the air in this final minute. If you can dial in 717-889-7181. Brother Dr. William Gibson, if he's able to call in. 717-889-7181. And we're going to give him a moment here.
So what are some of the comments people have been saying?
Oh, the comments. Oh, well,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people watching. Oh my goodness, what are people saying here? Okay, I can't read that well. But a lot of people are watching. That's a good thing. And I appreciate everybody who tuned in to hear what we had to say. I appreciate that so much. But I don't think Brother Gibson is able to dial in. I think my high school classmate and longtime friend, Kyle Russell Brown, as well as the Honorable James Porter for calling in here tonight. But anyone else, we're about to go off the air. 717-889-7181. Thank you so much, all of you who listened tonight. And I hope we said something to help us be reflective about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Well, that's it. Okay.